Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors, to this wild isle writing cast. I have with me two very special guests, Amaya Tenshi and Torin Fletcher, also known as Agrippa. Thank you both for coming on such short notice. We'll do our intros roundabouts here in a second. But first, this episode is going to be a kind of weird one. It is supposed to be part two to the crash course that came out before this, but it's also going to be narrative voice potence or pretense, but it's also going to be this weird roundtable thing. And so, you know, we're gonna do our best with that. All right, so we'll start with Agrippa, since you are new to the podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell the listeners what you do, what you write, and what you produce out there in the creative space.
All right. My name is Agrippa. Real name is Torin. I'm currently not exactly an author. I guess author in progress. My main work it's designed to be a trilogy. I guess you could probably call it a supernatural thriller with, I guess, dark fantasy elements. Still very much a work in progress. Slowly it's coming together. Besides that, I also am an illustrator as well. I have had many failed attempts to get various comics and graphic novels off the ground. Funny enough, actually, this current novel, its original form was another one of those graphic novel attempts. Yeah.
All right, Amaya, why don't you do a short intro for our listeners?
I'm an author. I have 2 books out. Dracula's Match, and the first one, which is Dracula's Guest. The third one should be out come December, barring anything crazy. That one will be called Dracula's Death. Eventually, if I'm able to get another tablet, I'd like to do a webcomic as well, but that's really, really on the back burner at this point.
Oh, you damn illustrators and artistic people. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I want to put out there, Dracula's Match is extremely good. I was extremely impressed with that. So those of you out there, go up and search up. If you haven't grabbed Dracula's Guest, buy it and then read it so that you can read Dracula's Match. Though, to be honest, you could, if you're impatient, just get Dracula's Match, because it was well enough written that I actually think even if I had read the first book, I really would have enjoyed it and I would not have been lost. So, don't be intimidated by the fact that it's a series going on. Just get it. And then also, if you want to help Torin out, Agrippa, he is very modest. His artistic and illustration skills are actually very excellent, which is why he is one of the 2 artists that I'm hoping to actually commission work from. So now I get to do my turn of shilling. You can find out about that over at wildowlet.com. There's a gigantic button for a Kickstarter campaign in which I'm raising funds to essentially commission real, art covers, because it's expensive and I'm an impoverished author. So help me out so you can help all of us out, because we're trying to support each other in this, let's say, AI eating us world. And I'm partly guilty of that if you see any of my promotional stuff, but I don't want to be guilty of it any more than I have to. So go check that out. Also, if you're an author and you're trying to develop your skills, you can also look at the Wild Isle Style Guide over in the editing section of my website. And there's a bunch of other stuff there as well. I've been producing more short stories and essays, putting audio tracks to those for your listening pleasure. And I've even updated the support section of my website to make it easier if you want to throw a couple dollars my way a month. With that out of the way, let's get into the topic for today, and that is style. So let us go. We'll go in reverse order here. When we use the word style, because that's really going to be the topic for today, Amaya, what comes to mind? And then I'll throw that question over to you, Torin. So, Amaya, what is style to you?
Style would be sort of extra artistic flourishes. So, you have your basics, right? You have to be, generally speaking, grammatically correct, everything spelled correctly. You need generally all the little bits of a narrative to be there. I say generally because some books and can get kind of nuts. Style is the specific flavor from the author. So, for example, like An Invisible Man by Ralph Waldo Ellison. Listen very carefully to what I just said there. He wrote his book in such a way that it sort of feels a little bit like hearing a jazz piece, kind of exploring and meandering around. So if you read it out loud, you actually kind of have that very serious sense and that almost musical quality to it. And you get different stories that do various things. That was the first one that came to my mind because it stood out to me so much. But a style is that personal touch that allows any reader to pick up a book and go, I'm pretty sure this is so-and-so.
Torin, what do you think? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying, I don't know if that's enough, but...
It's enough for us. Torin, what do you think? What do you think of style when I say that word comes to mind?
Actually, I more or less agree with Amaya. One thing is that immediately I think of is if I'm reading a particular author, I think one thing that's kind of if there is a lot of style present there, one thing that you kind of can immediately pick up is I guess you can kind of pick up what's important to them, just bits of their worldview and how they see things, even if it's kind of detached from the story. For example, I'm trying to think of some specific examples that I particularly know. I guess say with thrillers, for example, since I read a lot of those. For example, the author Dean Koontz, if you read any of his books, you can kind of immediately just tell who this guy is, and I guess what you can kind of almost pick up his ideals just from the prose, as kind of strange as that is to say.
I don't think it's all that strange. What this sounds to me is very much like how I described style when I taught it in literature, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. So, on the last podcast that I called a crash course, I covered content essentially, and that's the aspects like the genre, the plot typing, the setting, characterization, point of view, perspective, theme, all that kind of stuff. But what you suggested there is that there is a different, essentially, list of elements that would constitute style. And I actually do think I have something of that list, right? So in this case, from both of you, what it sounds like is we are talking about the something like the diction and the syntax, maybe the sentence lengths, variance of those lengths and complexities. We're talking about how much discursion, it's like the literal denotative language is used versus figurative language and reliance on connotation. We're also talking about music that Amaya brought up. That's like rhythm, meter, flow, that has to do with efficiency, but it also has to do with qualities of sound. So using devices such as alliterations, assonance, consonants. This is my favorite part of writing, if you can't tell. But I think also, Torin, what you just brought up is that you can feel the tone of the voice of the narrator based on the style, right? So tone seems to be this derived attribute that we're getting off of it. So if I look through my notes here, I actually have a definition that fits kind of well with that gigantic slew of elements that I just read across. Let's see. Yeah, so it's those components or features of a literary composition that have to do with the form of expression, rather than the content of the thought expressed. That seems to be, let's say, the idea that there is what I would call the composition side and the content side to any literary work. To throw the question back out there, how related or non-related do you guys think the composition of a piece, right, that has to do with all the stylistic elements that we just went over, how related do you think those are to the content? Can it be entirely divorced? Does it have to be is it rather tight? Can it be loose? Can it be all four? Can it be entirely detached or very close, or like, you know, I guess, does it have to be any which way? We'll start with, um, I'll throw that over to you first, Torin. We'll do like this kind of back and forth horseshoe thing. So Torin, yeah, how closely related do you think style has to be with the content of the piece, if at all?
That's honestly a good question because it's like I know that I've read examples where it's kind of there is no relation. I think it like hmm. I think ultimately it's better for it to be it is better for there to be a link than not. Ultimately is what I would say.
Can I throw a question in there for you really quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I like the way that you worded there. You said it's better for there to be a link than not. Do you think that when we're saying that it's better for there to be a link, that doesn't mean that it has to be a correlational link. It could also be like an inverse relational link, right? So I'll qualify that and I'll let you answer. So that means a work's style can fit with the content, or it could actually contrast against it for a particular effect. But the idea is you want there to be some relationship, whether that's together or apart, with the composition with the content. Am I getting that right? Like there should be some relationship. But yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of in visual arts terms, I kind of use it like you can make a drawing that does not adhere to something like color theory, but usually it's better if you do. I guess if that makes sense. Like, it's like you can get away with not doing it, but generally I say it's something that you generally should be there.
yeah. Amaya, what do you think about the relationship?
Uh, this is a little bit tricky to talk about with regards to literature, I think, because for me this would be a lot more accessible when talking about film. Because you can talk about like directorial decisions and how those clash or don't clash with the particular genre or story that you're telling. Let me think about literature here. Well, okay, so I know that my favorite author of all time, John Trevina or Ernest G. Henham, depending on what part of his career we're talking about, he did, to a certain extent, change his style to fit with the genres that he was writing. When he was writing under his real name, Ernest Henham, he wrote Gothic horror. And it was very sumptuous, very surreal, not particularly grounded, shall we say, which actually I think is part of what made his Gothic horror work so well. Later on, when he was writing, I'm not sure what to call his later genre. It's it. It was still fairly surreal. It had fairy tale-esque elements. Man, actually, I'm gonna have a really hard time even discussing this. Let me just say that the style that he chose at that point was, it still had the surreality, so there was still that element that was, his, and that kind of sumptuous descriptions. But he allowed it to be more airy. I don't know how to explain that a little bit better. And he allowed for a better sense of groundedness as contrast to the fantastic elements that he later on included. So that to me looks like a very conscious decision on his part. So he still kept his own style, but he adapted it to work with the genre change.
And that would make sense, because there, I mean, I actually really believe there has to be that relationship, and you can extra facilitate the content you're going for. Um, Torin mentioned color theory, right? So sometimes you want complementary colors, but sometimes you want contrasting colors. And the thing is, it's not totally arbitrary what counts as a
Mm-hmm.
complementary or contrasting color, right? Like there are there are certain, if you want to highlight something, you can hit a contrast with the style, but if you wanted it to, let's say, be suppressed, if you will, or muted, you would make the style, let's say, less contrasting and more what is expected, or if you wanted to exaggerate and enhance the effect. The one of the works that comes to mind for me that I brought up before is The Last Unicorn. For those of you who have not read it, it is actually fantastic. I was shocked at how impressed I was with that book. But the
Yep.
style of that the book is written in, um, I actually don't think you could get the same book if you changed the style. I don't think it would do the same thing, um, which does suggest that maybe uh, I'll throw it back to you, Maya. Do you think there might be some form of emergent property that comes out of that relationship between content and composition that means that the style never really exists perfectly in a vacuum, right? That when we try to write with a particular narrative voice, that inevitably produces because the voice has to be, in a story, right? Like it doesn't exist on its own outside from the content, but that it produces something emergent. Um, yeah, does that sound like that holds water to you?
Yes, I would say that you probably cannot have a voice without speaking, as it were, right? Without it existing in a medium of some sort. Um, I guess maybe you could say without it being incarnate in some way. Yeah, and as you say, the Last Unicorn is actually it's an amazing book. It should be required in schools, but it won't be. Uh, just a fantastic story.
Yeah,
Sorry, I don't know if you
and now
what. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, it's all right. We're gonna have these little bumps with the three of us, but so what I want to get into from here are questions about the importance of stylistic considerations, developing one's style. This is going to seem a little tangential, but I think it won't be once we dive into it. So I'm sure. No, actually, I'm not sure about this. So I'll ask you guys: have you witnessed what I'm about to describe? And that is a kind of ceding, like a surrendering of the importance or the valuing is a better word. So a surrendering or ceding of the valuing of style when it comes to writing or literature over to people who um, that we shouldn't be giving it to. So what I'm thinking of is people who claim to write, literary fiction who are celebrated in academia. That I saw quite a lot of when I was in grad school. Um, I find that the idea that we should focus on making or focus on the stylistic elements of our prose, um, oftentimes to be it looks looked at as stuffy. Like oh, like we like that's what those pretentious prats over in the academy who can't write well and don't and write things that no one wants to read do. So we're going to avoid that. I think that's a mistake, but I also don't know that my seeing that being prevalent uh, in and amongst particular writing communities is real. Like it might just be I'm in a weird little corner of the internet. I don't know. So what are your experience? I'll start with Torin first. Torin, have you seen that like a turning the nose up at really focusing on style as opposed to just focusing on the content, or am I just seeing things?
I haven't noticed the attitude. Now, granted, I haven't looked very deep into these, but I have noticed, I guess, examples of what you're saying in, these books in like the pages themselves. Where I won't name these, but I have read several, books that were recently published that, they were most of them were in the fantasy genre, but I did notice that just the prose and everything was very, I guess just there was no flourish to it. It was almost kind of written like a Wikipedia article, and because of that, I felt it kind of made these fantastic elements that, these like fantastic worlds just completely, it didn't do them any justice, I suppose. So is that what you're kind of talking about? Just this kind of like forsaking of just writing style, I suppose.
Yes, that's precisely actually what I'm talking about. Um, I'll ask you a quick follow-up question, then we'll let Amaya answer as well. Um, so I guess the question that came to my mind is, what do you think? is is happening to you as a reader. So you're reading, like, let's say you're reading a fantasy story, or it could be science fiction, whatever it is, and the prose is not speaking to you. There's something you said, it's like a Wikipedia article, as opposed to something that does have an effect on you. Like, if you really had to dig down and describe the difference between reading, let's say, a story where the prose facilitates the delivery of the content versus the prose is almost like in the way. Uh, what's the difference in your experience, as best as you can describe it?
I think like ultimately it comes down to is that I mean it's not I don't want to say that I don't get immersed because I guess whatever I'm like a heavy visualizer, so either way I can kind of end up seeing the story play out. But I do kind of I do feel that like the stylistic prose, like that is very critical for immersion. I feel, at least to some extent. Another thing I feel too is that even if there's like clunky stylistic prose that as you said, like gets in the way, I at least can sense that there's passion about it, in it, that the author, like, they're invested in what they're doing. If there is no style to speak of, and everything is just kind of written in this very neutral, almost, I guess, objective way, I kind of, I guess maybe this isn't entirely fair to say, but I kind of feel like the writer doesn't actually really care about what's going on sometimes. That's kind of what I take away from that.
Amaya, how about you? So if we remember, the first question is, do you see the same phenomenon, where there is a, let's say, lack of concern for style, and then, uh, yeah, we'll answer that one first, and then we can see if the follow up is relevant. But go ahead.
A lack of concern about style. Okay, so I mean, I think I've mentioned this, maybe not in your podcast, but in general. I don't read modern stuff. I generally speaking can't stand it. I know that from my creative writing courses, there was definitely an emphasis on, I don't want to say having no style, that's not quite true, but in some sense, removing as much of it as possible. Because there was like, the impression that I had was a lot of these professors have this idea that style is somehow a quirk of genre, i.e., and of course, writing genre is, terrible. As you know, it's a sin that you should never commit because you're trying to make money or appeal to the masses or whatever. I think to a certain extent, though, this disinterest or this distaste for heavy stylistic elements, it almost feels like it's the same sort of heavy materialist kind of push that you get even just in the visual arts, right? I mean, to a certain extent, it's almost a push towards ugliness, right? We don't want little extra flourishes. We don't want that little unnecessary, little curly Q on the end of your signature there, things like that. It needs to be ugly because if, quote unquote, regular people appreciate it, then there's something wrong with you. There's some sort of like elitist element to it. That's my suspicion about what the deal is.
That's super interesting. And here's why that's super interesting to me. So you came at it from the academic side, which, by the way, I witnessed that quite a bit, where there's this push toward a kind of neutralizing minimalism, right? To strip away all the spirit, all the soul, which the interesting thing about that, though, is that ties in right to what Torin was saying. So Torin just brought up that, and I think uh, probably what Torin was seeing is actually more away from the academic side. So we're seeing this on both ends of the spectrum. There's a kind of disdain for um, the art form, perhaps for different reasons. And maybe this is sort of like this falls along the spectrum of art versus escapism and propaganda. So, for those of you guys who don't know, or maybe listeners who haven't seen it, I had a conversation with Nathan Cumberledge, who comes on the podcast quite frequently, and we built out this spectrum where on one end you have raw escapism, where there is no fundamental let's say, truth or moral or lesson or theme to the work. It's all titillation. It's all uh, like mere base impulse uh, gratification. But then on the opposite end, you had this idea with propaganda where the actual art is stripped out and the idea, the solution, the theme is an answer to a question that is prefabricated, right? There's no human exploration. And if there's no exploration, that means it's divorced in a sense from the person's relationship with reality. It's like a prepackaged answer. And that really reminds me of this situation where on one side, with the literary side, we have this idea where let's obliterate all of we could almost call it the natural component. What I mean by nature is those things that pull the feelings up out of us, that make us care, that make us interested, which is why someone would bother to read it because it becomes relevant to our lives. And on the other end, with the escapist end, um, it's as if the person doesn't care about the the potential profundity or the any deeper experience, right? It's like the guy who just wants to have his basic sensory pleasures met, and like if that's all he gets, that's all he gets. He doesn't really care about any of that deeper stuff. Now, where was I going with all that? You mentioned. Now, see, now I've lost it. Do you guys want to jump in while I recollect myself? Is anyone?
The well, okay, so if we want to talk about it from the academic sense of we're like 100% materialists to a certain extent, we have completely divorced, I guess you want to say, the let's say the body or the world from like the spiritual or the emotional or the mind space, if you want to put it that way. And that might be why you're seeing this sort of either or, right? Because certainly with the literary elitists, basically despising genre for being genre because like the masses might appreciate it or whatever. They refused, for example, as far as I can tell, to accept that you could have genre with literary value, right? You could argue Dune or Lord of the Rings, or there's a number of genre books that would qualify for that. And that for it to be literature, you basically almost cannot enjoy it, right? Because it may be as far divorced as possible from your disgusting, meat sack self. So, and like I said, I think that's just a symptom of our society as it current, like the trend in the general culture. Because I don't think this was an issue back in like the classical periods, for example. I mean, they would, I think, view, and this is why everything was made to be beautiful, etc. Right? That you should use your senses and your physicalness in order to kind of like look higher at the above space, but also that there's something wrong per se with you having the physical senses, like having eyes and enjoying beauty and things like that. I don't know if that's well phrased or not.
I mean, I certainly think it is, but before I jabber on, Torin, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I was actually going to say I almost kind of like I know like obviously this all originated from just the academic circles, but I wonder like how much of what we see too with this is kind of like not simply just driven by I guess like opportunism as well. I mean like because a lot of like these books where I saw this were these kind of new up and coming authors, and I do wonder like if there's this element where a lot of these people just simply never learned to write beautiful prose, or they're not well read, or whatever, and they simply just kind of almost go along with what these academics push just because it benefits them too. You can see similar stuff like this in visual art, where there's this kind of dumbing down of the skill level that a lot of these people that are going in there kind of just gleefully go along with because it benefits them as well.
Yeah, I think I could tie this together in an interesting way. So I can't remember the guy's name. he did an interview with Jordan Peterson. He was in literature, and he was really into applying critical theory to different literary works, and he talked about it being like a taking of pleasure in the revenge against people who he could never match, right? So you have all the greats of history, um, and I actually think that that brings both of these sides together, right? So what we really have here are, the people in academia in the modern sense have a desire. I actually know this is the case. They have a desire to feel superior of those people who came from the past, who actually they're not as good at. They can't recreate the great works. And then we have the up and comers, right? This is true in the commercial side. I would even argue this is probably true on the indie side a lot as well, because that's where the commercial is expanding into. Is that there is a disdain for the cultivation of skill, because it's easier to be like, to scorn, like look down your nose and say like, oh, well, that's just pretentious prattle. Why do I care about, implementing some form of alliteration, or, why do I care about figurative language? Like, why do I have to use all these freaking similes and metaphors, I could just write it and, so do you think that's what this is? Is this like revenge against, let's say, a revenge against the art form, and the art form essentially being some type of, I guess I should mention what I think an art form is. I think, Amaya, you'll probably want to speak to this. So I think that art is when we as human beings, we take something out of nature, and uh, we humanize it in such a way. Why do I use the word humanize? We make it in relation to us, and in a way that answers something about our relationship with the world. And if you're religious, just instead of putting the world, just put God there, and that's what art would be, right? So if I said that in a religious sense, you're taking something from a state of nature, and you're bringing it into relationship to us, as we are, in as far as we can be in relationship with God. Uh, that might be a little bit too much, but what do you is that an okay way of conceptualizing art? And are these people taking revenge at their inability to uh, basically relate to God? What do you think, Amaya?
I think, yeah, that would be what you would consider maybe like sacred art, if you want to put it that. Like art has degrees, right? All the way down to essentially what amounts to porn, which is like, just 100% titillation with absolutely no point, you know. But that to a certain extent, because I think that generally speaking, yeah, that would be the definition I would go with. But there is almost also an element, not just of including or condensing, let's say, a bunch of meaning into sort of a singular package, right? This little kind of almost a pill form. That certainly the higher art, would have an element of inspiration, right? Where someone looks at it and they go, "Wow, that it's amazing that that's even possible for someone to create." And in that sense, potentially, this, to get to what Agrippa was talking about, because by the way, the dumbing down of art that's been going on for a while. That's not a new thing. There is a certain element, because when I was younger and I was trying to do art, etc., I more or less was, punished, shall we say, for attempting to do well. We'll put it that way. When I was being taught painting, for example, in my course, we ended up going to an art museum, and in that one there was a huge canvas. It must have been about 13 feet by like 10 feet. And the whole canvas had been painted some shade of like neutral blue. On the top of the canvas, there was a large white blotch where you could still see the brush strokes, and you can actually see through the paint to the blue underneath. And then below that was a darker blue blotch. And I was 13 at the time, and I told my art teacher, like, I could paint that. And she turned around and she said, "No, you couldn't." And I was like, okay. or when she had us doing art, I was trying to paint things. She was telling me, "Oh, I'm not allowed to paint a picture of an actual thing. It has to be of a painting of nothing." I'm like, all right. So there was an active, I would say, attempt at degrading even the concept of art or beauty. And yeah, I think there is an element of the envy because it's hard to be, like one of those Renaissance painters, or to be Rubens or even anybody. What is this, like that Kurt Vonnegut short that I had mentioned the other day, the name of which I can never remember. Yeah, that's what I would say. It's probably envy to a certain extent. And someone feeling defeated by the fact that they don't think they measure up, and rather than attempting to measure up or saying, well, thank goodness somebody could make it, they go, nah, I'll tear it all down. Harrison Bergeron, that's the short. I can remember the name of that thing.
Torin, you want to jump in on that, or?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I completely agree. I mean, I think there is this kind of this revenge of the untalented aspect to this that I think really it more or less is almost kind of a symbiotic relationship with these academia types that are pushing this. I think you really like you can kind of see this everywhere in popular culture where just everywhere you look, there's been no significant works of art really in any sector. And I think it's because there's kind of this unspoken rule that nobody is allowed to do anything interesting. And I think I don't necessarily know that this is all of the reasoning, but I do think some like the kind of like the woke orthodoxy that's enforced, like part of the reason why some of these rules are so flexible, I think, is specifically so they can be used to kind of stifle these creative expressions that would potentially make people feel inadequate.
Yeah, Amaya, did you want to jump in there too?
No, it's okay. I always I get overeager.
I'd much rather have you over eager here on the Wild Isle podcast than what's the opposite of an eager beaver? A depressed platypus? What's a better word than depressed? Before we go on, I wanted to bring something up before we run out of time that was brought up to me by Matt Dawson, who's been on the show a couple times, and I talked to Timo Burnham. So we're all in the indie writing space. We kind of know each other. And the thing I talked about with Timo, that Matt brought up the subject, was an underserved audience. And I wanted to run this idea past you guys because I think there might be. I don't know that this is going to connect back into what we just talked about, but I suspect it will. So we talked about how, particularly with young men, you can't get them to read. They're more attracted to visual medium, and it just literature can't compete. And there has been a push, and a valiant push. I respect it because I think, we want our young people to be literate, and we don't want half of our young people therefore to be illiterate. Like, you can kind of get teenage girls and women to read in general, particularly fiction. Trying to get young men, difficult. But the push has been, I think, to fixate on like action-packed content, and rather but I think that's actually the wrong aim. And I'm going to pitch this idea. I think that actually one of the reasons why we're seeing a big chunk, particularly would say of young men who are disinterested in reading, is because we've progressively lost interest in stylistic writing. Why do I think that? Well, when we talked about style earlier and composition, Torin brought up it makes you feel something, and Amaya, you brought up it makes you kind of feel something even down to a level, like a spiritual level, and it kind of, there's a little bit of something deeper there that gets evoked out of you, right? I'm going to use that word evocative here. And I think actually, if we think about what young men like, visual mediums. Well, what's the closest thing to that in literature? That's going to be imagery, most fundamentally. And imagery in literature isn't just the visual, but it's also the what you describe in terms of smell and sound and feeling and taste. Um, and I actually think you only get proper evocation of emotion via imagery from a reader if you can stylistically employ it, right? Like you have to be able to use figures of speech. You have to be able to use qualities of sound. We mentioned music and how certain pieces can almost sound jazzy. I think Amaya, you brought that up. Well, if we know something about music, is that I kind of buy into this a little bit. Like music is a rather pure art form because it does evoke feelings in you without having to secondarily evoke those feelings through another image. So like you can play a tone that sounds sad, even though that tone sounds like nothing that a sad thing ever makes. It's like this weird thing where like it just you hear it and it's like that's sadness. It's like why is it sadness? I don't know, but it is, and everyone agrees, and we all feel it, or joy or levity, or you can make music with tension. And I think style and stylistic considerations, which I'll give some examples of here in a bit, are necessary in order to provide that imagery, to provide that music within the prose that evokes those feelings that would then draw in. I'm sure it would draw everybody more in to reading, to be honest, because right now the mass of readers for fiction is like women 40 and up, and they're reading mostly romance novels, which I don't count as art. Right. So, uh, so uh, which one of you wants to weigh in on my proposition there? And I'll summarize it in one sentence: is that actually you have to have really good style in order to appeal to very visually uh, oriented readers. What do you think of that?
I 100% agree.
Why do you agree, Torin, the illustrator? I think you have some unique insights on this.
Well, it's pretty much like it's that much. It's basically style is a visualization tool. Like I said, I think I mentioned earlier, like it really can, at least if for the visually minded reader, it can make or break the immersion that much. Some of them like me, I want to kind of take in as much as I can and do my best to actually place myself in there. And to do that, there has to be a lot of style. There can't be just this neutral kind of uninvolved, very concise prose, I suppose.
Amaya?
I find the idea very interesting. I don't know necessarily how well it's going to work in practice, but something that I think about is, once upon a time, plenty of men were reading. Now, it may have always been the case that men, maybe by and large, tended to read less. I could be wrong about that. But, like L'Amour to Arthur was not written, for example, for 4-year-old women, back in the day. So I do wonder if, on the one hand, maybe there's a stylistic, reason why young men or men in general are not reading, or if it's possible that it's just, again, we're not telling the kinds of stories that men like to read. Because, it's fairly clear that, oh, goodness, come on, brain. I can't remember the name of the author or the main character from this freaking series anymore. Oh, no! Man, wow, my brain's not working, but there are definitely series that exist out there that are basically male readers, and they tend to read them. Clive Cussler, there we go. Right. Very few, probably 4-year-old women are reading his works. I don't know what the split would be on Stephen King. It seems like Stephen King is certainly very popular amongst male readers. I think Michael Crichton might also be. So, So maybe attacking it from both points of view would be the way to get there.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. There would need to be some confluence. If you're writing highly stylistic stories that focus on relationships, that's going to necessarily, lean more away from a particularly young male audience. And if these are adventure stories, if these are, coming of age heroes' journeys, if they are um, anything of that sort, that's going to appeal. But I have some examples I wanted to read through. Hopefully, it won't take me too long. And I think they do demonstrate that style does a lot. This first one's going to be a bit long, and who knows, maybe this is all we'll have time for. Um, but I want, and you'll probably have heard it. This is the poem Jabberwocky by
Mm.
Lewis Carroll. Or not Lewis Carroll, sorry, Lewis Carroll. So I'm going to read it through. For you listeners who have not heard this, it's awesome. This is one of my favorite little poems, and you're about to see why, because I think it demonstrates what something you can do with style when there's almost a void of content behind it. Not exactly; it's the wrong way to say that. But without further ado, I'm going to read this poem, Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All misme were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the fruminous Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the Maxime foe he sought. So rested he by the Tumtum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the Tugly wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumping back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjoyous day, Callooh, Callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All misme were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. All right. Uh, have either of you not heard that poem before?
I have definitely heard it.
As have I.
Okay. So unfortunately, I can't be like, okay, what does this mean? Um, the in terms of before I just jabber on, in terms of style, do either of you want to comment on how what you think I might be going for, what you might just see in it? If who cares what I'm thinking? Um, in terms of style and how that poem is able to actually use essentially not content. Those aren't a lot of those are not content elements. They're purely sounds, essentially like music, in order to communicate the little narrative poem. Someone throw something at me about Jabberwocky. How, at least, yeah, somebody.
I'll go if Agrippa doesn't want to go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The poem, of course, does. I don't want to say ape, right? Because in this sense, this is very intentional, and very thought out. But let's say is definitely meant to evoke, if we're going to use that word, a sense of some of those, classic poems we've had in literature going all the way back. Obviously, it still has the meter and everything else to it. All of the words, even though they're nonsense, are placed in such a way that you know at least the function of the word. Like, you know that the mome raths, whatever those are some sort of noun, and they're almost undoubtedly some sort of animal or creature or beast. Outgrave. They're doing whatever that means. And so, yeah, it allows you can still piece together quite a bit of the meaning. In the sense of in the purely abstract, right? Because you can't know for an absolute fact what it is that they're doing. From the structure of it, and if you think about other poems, right? Because this is kind of what I think is being included here. Then you have a sense that what that's establishing is sort of a sense of tranquility and peace. So I think the reason that this poem works actually is because it exists within a larger, I guess, library, if you will, of poetry, which is very like it, that allows you to sort of, with the low resolution, sort of place onto the various bits of it what is being communicated. But yeah, in a purely in the purely abstract, most minimal, most low resolution possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Torin, do you have any opinions on Jabberwocky?
Most of mine really kind of just again pertains to kind of just a more base sense where I just feel like the names and the prose alone kind of accomplish in instilling kind of this, I guess, like, I suppose, otherworldly kind of sense in the reader. It kind of just straight from the start, it kind of succeeds in doing this. Again, just with its use of descriptors and whatnot. You know, I probably kind of look into these things a bit different from a literary minded person. But it conjures up these very fantastical images. You know, just basically with actual very little obviously there's not really an excess of descriptors. Color is not mentioned, texture is not mentioned much, but I'm still able to kind of get a very clear picture from this poem.
Yeah, I have the advantage of I have it up in front of me, and I think a lot of the quality of the picture comes from actually the sound. Um, Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely a lot of assistance, like Amaya mentioned, with the placement because that helps you understand, what the function of each nonsense word is. But if I say the like slithy, right, that makes you think of like anything that you get that S sound. It makes me think of a snake. It makes me think of something slithery. It makes me think of maybe something mossy, right? There are a bunch of associations, those are connotations that arrive out of that set the tone of the poem immediately, right? Now I know that there is a way to translate a bunch of these words because Lewis Carroll wrote one. I can't remember, and I didn't prepare it because I'm a fool. But um, the actual, the actual, like, "'twas brillig and the slithy toes." It's actually something really silly, like some animal walking around a fountain or something like that in like the yard. Uh, but that's not the point. The function here of the first stanza and last stanza where it repeats itself is to set the tone or tone with an N of it being kind of dark, right? Because when it goes into the beware the Jabberwock, but there's a bunch of words like Vorpal sword. I bet a bunch of people listening to this think that that's a word. Vorpal. It's not a word. Where
It
you
is.
heard that was. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just saying it is now, thanks to D&D. I think
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Well,
it
actually,
wasn't.
I think that. Yeah, it wasn't before. I think they changed it to Vorpal, like Vorpal sword. They added a couple like a syllable to it or something. But yeah, that's what I was about to point out. Is in D&D, you all think that this is where that came from. You illiterate bastards. So go read. Um, but yeah, but Vorpal works because like the V. I don't know what it is, but there's something about the V sound. I know it reminds me of like vivisection. There's something sharp about it. So when you say the sword is a Vorpal sword, like my brain immediately says it's sharp. Even if when I first encountered the D&D iteration of it, Vorpal sword, I kind of understood that like it was an intensification of the function of the cutting. But there's other ones too, like galumphing, right? That's obviously like uh, it's hard to describe, but you galumph like it's got this what's the right word, galloping to it. Galloping is the best way I can think of it. Now you could think of like he went galumphing back or he went galumphing back. Obviously we have the context, so it's positive, but either way it serves to have that Um, I compare it to like an anapestic meter. So if you read a lot of Poe's poem, they use anapestic meter, and they have this kind of quickening, rapid rhythm to them. Um, Fruminous, right? The Fruminous Bandersnatch. By the way, if you saw the Black Mirror movie Bandersnatch, that's where they got this name too. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, a lot of inspirations here. Um, but yeah, fruminous makes me think of like froth foaming at the mouth, ferocious, fierce. There's something about the F. Like, even if you pay attention to what it does to your mouth when you do that FR sound, if you look at yourself in the mirror, you're snarling to make that noise. Why am I bringing up all of that? Well, I'm bringing up all of that because I think actually every little tiny thing like that changes the way that you connect in with the thing that you're reading. In this case, it was Jabberwocky. Um, there's another example. Have read it a bunch of times on the podcast, so I won't read the whole thing because it's kind of long. Um, let's see. Yeah, I'll read just this bit of it, and you guys can tell me if you recognize it. Um, the listeners should certainly recognize it, but I think it's important to point this out. Along the crooked, unpaved streets, with their heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers staggered roaring. Steel glinted in the shadows where wolf preyed on wolf, and from the darkness rose the shrill laughter of women and the sounds of scuffings and strugglings. And I could go on because there's more and more and more of that. But yeah, I'll read over just a bit of that again because it was quick. So yeah, along the crooked, unpaved streets with their heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers staggered, roaring. Steel glinted in the shadows where wolf preyed on wolf, and from the darkness rose the shrill laughter of women and the sounds of scuffings and strugglings. I think I read that wrong the first time. Doesn't matter. Um, we'll throw it to Tor, and then we'll get Amaya's opinion on that. Did anything stand out to you when I was reading that? Um, that in that evocative sense that I mentioned before.
You mean like anything from the rest? I would.
Just go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was to answer that question. Anything in particular in the context of what we're talking about with style, right? So we're talking about uh, we focused a lot on sound because we just read a poem, but in this case, the particular diction chosen and the figures of speech. Anything stand out to you there? And I can read it again if need be.
Generally, it again, I believe actually in these kind of I actually got a sense of texture as well. So it generally, it pretty much it just painted the scene very well for me. If you could actually read it again.
Yeah, I will, and I'll even send it. I should have done it to begin with, but that way you can read along with me. We have technology. Wait, oh no, attachment. So for those of you who don't understand that there's a technical error going on, there's a slight technical error where I have to paste something into a different program to paste it into Discord. Boom. All right. And I will read it again. Along the crooked, unpaved streets with their heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers staggered, roaring. Steel glinted in the shadows where wolf preyed on wolf, and from the darkness rose the shrill laughter of women and the sounds of scuffings and strugglings.
There's a lot of emphasis on sound, which actually, in terms of immersion, actually, again, just I feel puts the reader almost kind of in the setting. Where you can kind of almost envision being there. It
Yeah,
gives you the sense that this section of whatever setting this is actually lived in, is actually alive. That people actually dwell in this part of whatever world this is.
yeah. Amaya, do you see that as well? And if so, what do you think is causing that feeling?
So we don't have full-on onomatopoeias, right? But as this would, of course, be quite a bit like the Jabberwocky poem, where a lot of words being used here, and there's a lot of modifiers on the words. It's not just unpaved streets or just crooked, streets. It's crooked, unpaved, right? Heaps of refuse, sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers, staggered. We have multiple words all coming together to give an extremely clear, crisp picture of what specifically we're talking about. Steel glinting. Everything is sensory, generally speaking, to put you, as you say, like in the scene where you can see it, you can smell it, you can hear it. And sorry, I'm trying to remember where I was going with that. I don't remember. Shoot.
No, it's all right. If you do, just like shout Alex Jones style into the camera to interrupt me as I'm talking here. Um, yeah, but there's actually a lot here. So like the crooked unpaved streets thing is actually way deeper than I think people give it credit for. And so crooked. This comes with the particular diction, right? Because I talked about all those elements that I listed before. If I scroll up on my notes, so in terms of diction. Crooked is a good word. Why is crooked a good word? Because it doesn't just mean not straight. It also kind of means evil or malignant or broken, or you see what I mean? There's a bunch of meanings in that one word. So that word is doing like triple lifting. Now, unpaved provides the tactile texture of the streets. There's a bunch of S sounds. Those are the onomatopoeia kind of feeling things Amaya noticed. Well, then also we have heaps of refuse, right? Like it's not just trash. It's like this like I don't know about you, but it's like you have garbage, but then if I say I have heaps of garbage, all of a sudden there's um I I'm trying to figure out what it is about the word heap, right? It's like this mismatch. It's a mess of it. There's a bunch. It also rhymes off of street. So there's like a play here, along the crooked, unpaved streets with their heaps. Like it helps you move into refuse and sloppy puddles. But actually, if I really think about it, I kind of want to vomit into my mouth a little bit when I think of like unpaved heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles. Like
Yeah,
that's disgusting. Like what the fuck is in these? What are these puddles? like, um, and then they
they're
put it
not
next
just
to drunk. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
they're not just puddles. They're like the worst possible puddles imaginable.
Well, they're
Yeah,
sloppy like the drunks, right? Go ahead, Torin.
I would say I almost imagine kind of like this refuse is like melting, almost kind of like producing this sludge. It's forming these puddles that actually are not necessarily water, but kind of this ichor-like substance. Very
Yeah.
powerful imagery, let's just say.
Yeah, and then like because I could go on and on about this, but like because people get sloppy drunk too, right? So you have these sloppy puddles. It's wedged between refuse and the drunkards, and then the drunkards like they're drunken roisterers, right? There's something about
Mhm.
like roister one like you have to slow down to goddamn say the word in that sentence, which gives it as kind of big emphasis, and it reminds me of like a freaking rooster, right? So you've got this like giant cock sticking up in the middle of the sentence, to throw a play on words myself, and it's roaring, right? So you get this all of a sudden this blast of a volume at the end of the sentence. uh the steel glinting also I find, and yeah, any either of you guys just like again scream in as you go because I'll get carried away. But steel glinting in the shadow, so all of a sudden uh if the steel is active, this if for those of you who struggle with active and passive voice, here's something that you pay attention to stylistically. The steel is like animate, right? It's alive, and its eyes are opening, glinting, seeing you in the darkness. Where wolf preys on wolf, right? Like again, now we have a metaphor, and that it's richer because it's predators killing each other in this freaking back unpaved alley where it's all full of basically like shit-filled puddles, and everyone's celebrating in the death, and the daggers themselves are alive and glinting and blinking and looking at you. And the women are laughing with these shrill, high-pitched cackles like they're freaking witches, and which is the use of like the shrill laughter of women and the sounds. And again, we get the alliteration, like shrill sounds, scufflings, strugglings. Um, the Sorry, I'm getting too excited. I apologize, friends.
Okay. We're allowed to get excited about literature over here, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. If you guys have time, I'd like to share. By the way, do you guys know where that little bit was from?
I actually don't.
I admittedly do not either.
Oh, good, because I've shared it too many times. I was embarrassed. It's from a story I bring up a lot. It's from Tower of the Elephant, which is one of the Conan stories, and it's like it's from the most famous paragraph from that story, which is the most famous story of the Conan stories, because of it's so rich. Like for your guys' reading pleasure, I'll go ahead and paste that, but I'll move on to a different one here to read through, because I think we've got more fun literature to do the literary equivalent of weeb over. There's like the whole paragraph, and if you guys are ever looking at it, it does that the whole time, so it's like you have twice as much content. But what I will share with you guys, and I'll read it out here for the podcast. And I think I've read this on the podcast before as well, so I apologize those of you who have had to listen to this over and over again. But it's worth it for this conversation. There we go. So this one is from Blood Meridian, and I'll read it out, and then you guys you can kind of read it with me and tell me what you see in it that allows its effectiveness, because this, when I first read it, it stuck in my mind and it never left. So it's that night they rode through a region electric and wild, where strange shapes of soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horses' trapping, and the wagon wheels rolled in hoops of fire, and little shapes of pale blue light came to perch in the ears of the horses and in the beards of the men. So I'll start talking on that, and then you guys could please jump in. The one thing I want to point out is uh, this it's one sentence, it looks like, and this sentence is the wagon wheels going around. You can hear it if you listen, right? Particularly when you hit the point. So let's say that night they rode through a region electric and wild, where strange shapes, here right there, where strange shapes of soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horses' trappings, and the wagon wheels rolled. It doesn't stop, right? There's a kind of monotony, and you kind of have to give yourself into it. Like if you try to force it to read like a normal sentence, you'll get all screwed up. It's like trying to read Lovecraft like a modern person would try to read. Like you can't do it. You have to take the rhythm it wants you to take. But I think there's this kind of looping effect that gets in there, and when you start to move with it, you can feel the wagon wheels going over the desert in the midnight with all these band of murderers and scalpers. Um, that's what stuck out to me. There's a lot that sticks out to me. Either of you, anything about this that particularly stands out stylistically?
I mean, it's a run-on sentence to actually indicate that you're running on, which is kind of fun. I know Howard and Lovecraft were also friends in real life, weren't they?
Surprisingly, yes, because Lovecraft hated Irishmen, and Robert was an Irishman.
Oh man. Oh man. Actually, I'm noticing something here. We have wagon wheels rolled in hoops. We actually have 3 words all together that evoke the sense of roundness or wheels or circles. That cannot have been by accident. Region
No,
electric. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's awesome that you pointed it out because I actually have not noticed. I've read this a million times and I haven't even must have not been reading very closely. But that is actually awesome. Like the wheels rolled in hoops. Um, it evokes the feeling of the rolling, the monotony, the motion is it's in the damn prose, right? Like I was super cool. I love this stuff, man. Torin, do you see anything in there, or Amaya, do you have something more you want to say?
We need to let Agrippa talk.
Oh. I was actually going to say, admittedly, I actually had to read some of it several times just because admittedly, it did kind of confuse literal-minded me. But, no, actually, I can actually see where soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horse's trappings. It took me a moment but I can actually see it kind of like where he's kind of evoking this gleaming of the moonlight as they run.
Yeah, well, actually, I think it's I know technically this doesn't exist, but like what people call heat lightning, like that, when it flashes over the sky through the clouds. That was always my understanding because the region's electric and wild, right?
Oh,
So
okay. So they're talking
Well,
literal there, where it's actually storming.
well,
well,
you
sort
guys
of
know
both.
about ball.
Go ahead, go ahead.
You guys know about ball lightning, right?
Maybe by a
I've
different
heard of
name.
it.
Explain it.
That every so often I hear this is like an extremely rare phenomenon. You can have lightning which will strike, but it's in the shape of a ball. And my husband talked about it actually back when he was alive. And it kind of like floats down almost like a soap bubble. It can like roll across the floor. He said he actually came across a story where apparently one person said one of these things bounced off a cat, like without electrocuting it, which is quite interesting. But just something to think about. And I don't know, that could be kind of what's being evoked here, because I have a sense also that he's getting into a little bit of like Saint Elmo's fire with
That's not. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying that's actually initially what came to mind before, like, then I started interpreting it symbolic, where I'm like, oh, they're talking about moonlight. But the first time I read this, I actually thought it was like some supernatural effect where they were literally swimming through this like Saint Elmo's fire kind of effect.
Well, I mean, you could be. I think there's supposed to be that sense, because that stuff is eerie. I don't know if you've ever seen that either.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that's also what I think that's why he's saying the soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horse's trappings and the wagon wheels rolled in hoops of fire. There is electricity, and again, the St. Elmo's fire that is caught into everything, which is also how it can perch in ears and on beards of men, etc. So it's a, in that sense, I guess if you want to go with the St. Elmo's fire, we usually think of St. Elmo's fire, of course, in the context of ships, because that's generally speaking, I think, where you end up hearing it being talked about. I don't think we hear it getting talked about in any other context usually. So it's interesting that you say swim, because that's probably where you're getting that sense from.
So Saint Elmo's fire, is that when like because that's what I've heard referred to as maybe heat lightning, which I know is the wrong term for it. Where you've got like in the sky, it looks like it's like a branching out of almost, it looks like lightning, like purple lightning that reaches out claw like. Or am I totally misunderstanding? Because it's the first time I've heard that term before.
I'm going to try to see if I can find a picture, which is going to be really difficult, of St. Elmo's fire. I don't think anyone. This is one of those things that you really generally have to be there, where it's a strange looking phenomenon. You get like the right kind of like static electricity in the atmosphere. And the reason why you used to see this like for ships, is way back in old sailing days. You could occasionally, if you're out at sea and the conditions are just correct, get just a massive static buildup in like the mast of the ship and the rigging and everything else. And so the entire top of the ship, in the rigging and the sails and the mast would be just crackling with this strange green electricity, and it wouldn't kill you or anything. It's just there. It's almost like having an aurora borealis, but like on your ship. And apparently, yes, it is green. So,
Yeah.
I thought it was like almost kind of like it was like this almost kind of like hazy, I guess like mist. Like it's not actually necessarily electricity and like it's not like arcs of lightning, is it?
Right, right, right. It's more like it's like a glow, but yeah. And I'm looking for pictures on the internet, and the internet's like, no one has photos of this. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's really
Well,
annoying.
what I am finding photos of does look like what here in Wheeling, West Virginia, people called heat lightning, which seems to be the St. Elmo's fire. That's what I interpreted. That was, shining, like, because that stuff hangs in the air for a lot longer than like a lightning strike does. Because I remember I saw it when I was a kid, and yeah, that effect is the region electric. But to jump back into style, that was a fun excursion learning about St. Elmo's fire. For those of you who like to learn, you're learning things here on the Wild Owl podcast. Um, yeah, but the fact that the region's electric also mean it's kind of like alive, right? Because like if you can use that word to describe things as being tense, um, and it's tense because it's wild, where strange shapes, right? So like there are things that you don't recognize. It's kind of like evoking the fear of the unknown. Um, let's see. Yeah, there's a depth to the feeling, if you will, that I think gets evoked by the particular choices of words used, and I think small things like that make a huge difference. The reason why I'm calling attention to it is that I really actually just trying to convince people out there who might be listening that yeah, like picking the right word can take a sentence from a kind of discursive, boring thing where the reader kind of doesn't really feel like you care to packing it so full of meaning, right? That you get this massive, profound, evocative effect is really what I wanted to push out there. There's another much shorter McCarthy quote that I will go ahead and share. This one is I want to talk about because of the issue with abstraction. This is something I don't hear people talk about very much at all. Um, there we go. This one's from The Road, and it's a description of something that the protagonist, well, there's a co-protagonist, the father and son. The father sees this in a dream, but it's rather profound, and it is crouching there, pale and naked and translucent, its alabaster bones cast up in shadow on the rocks behind it, its bowels, its beating heart. And what I want to call attention to here is the lack of abstracts. There are, I think, essentially none. I don't think anything in this is abstract at all. I think it's all concrete. And this is something I think people might get confused about, but when you're writing fiction, I actually think that concretes are almost, not always, but almost always more evocative than abstractions are going to be. And just to quickly go over this because I don't want to stretch it on too long. So, crouching is a thing that animals do, right? So, right away, that's a physical action that can be imagined. Pale, right? So, that's something you can see. There's a visual. Naked. That not only has a visual element to tell you that it's uncovered, but it has a tactile element as well, right? Because if it's naked, it's not going to be furry. It's probably not going to be. It might be soft, but if it's soft, it's going to be soft in that kind of skinny, clammy kind of way, and it's translucent so you can see through it. Now all of a sudden it's membranous, pale, naked, and translucent, right? It almost has gonna have like a stickiness to it, like you might either your fingers will stick or they would tear through if you touched it. It's alabaster bones, right? So we have the bones and the color of the bones that we're seeing through this pale, translucent skin, white, and cast, right? Cast is an action, like you cast a fishing rod. It's the shadows are thrown upon the rocks. So the shadow is a physical thing you can see. There's a physical action of the shadow being tossed, hitting another physical object, the rock behind it. Um, Being the direct location, and then the next things aren't even sentences, right? You just what you see, it's bowels, it's beating heart. um it's all very visceral, to to use a proper word for that. Why am I bringing all that up? You know uh Torin, what do you think? What do you think? Do you think that uh, like how much of a difference do you notice when it's all concrete as opposed to, let's say, something where there might be a mixture of abstractions in there?
Admittedly, when it's all concrete, it does bring in like a more definite picture. Whereas if there's abstractions there, it actually does it leaves a lot of room to, I guess, speculate, on behalf of the reader, and in ways I think that makes it more interesting. Not only because it gets them more involved, in reading the lines as well.
Yeah, am I anything to say on the use of concretes there?
Well, I think definitely the concretes help place you, directly. Then I would agree that generally speaking, concrete is always going to end up having more impact than abstract. In the same way that, like, abstract has a difficult time hitting in general. That's why you kind of want a concrete conflict. You want concrete stakes. You want concrete settings. You know.
Yeah,
Uh,
this is something.
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, this is something that I think people don't realize because they don't think they. I think a lot of listeners, if you don't know this, what an abstraction is. An abstraction is a essentially generalization of categorization, right? So it is a moving away from that is which is toward um, let's say increasingly broader pictures, broader shadows, right? So the more times that we make reference to abstracts, the more vague by definition we are being, which means we're not being specific. And the thing is, it's sort of like, you see the commercials like the starving kids in Africa, right? Like they'll show you one
Mm-hmm.
starving kid. They could show you a picture of like 100,000, but you wouldn't care because
Mm-hmm.
that's not how our emotions work, right? We invest stakes in a particular, not in an abstract, not in something that isn't real. Um, so yeah, definitely the concretes are going to be necessarily more evocative for that same exact reason. I actually have, and I think this will probably be the last one, just for the sake of time. I don't want to drag you guys on too long. An example of something where a lot of abstractions are interspersed. Now, I think this is done successfully. This is by Algernon Blackwood. If you recognize it from Lovecraft, because he puts it at the beginning of Call of Cthulhu, he quotes Algernon. But it is the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. You can see there lots of actual abstractions, like you don't like correlate. Like correlations don't exist in physical space or exist in physical action. Contents is kind of general and vague. The human mind is even something that's kind of ethereal. Um, or even mercy, like the most merciful thing. Is mercy is a bit of an abstraction. It's a category of action, but it's not an action itself. A placid island of ignorance. Island is kind of concrete, but it's surrounded by things that pull it away from its concreteness. Same thing with Black Seas is concrete, but we make it less physical by attaching infinity to it, right? So Black Seas of infinity. Um, Now, I actually think this particular section works. Amaya, do you think this particular quote works? And if so, what do you think makes it still have an evocative effect, despite the fact that we're moving away from the concrete words?
Well, I might say that we actually still have concrete words. They're just being used in a more abstract sense. Like, we're not literally on a placid island. We're not literally in the midst of actual Black Seas. And that might help because, and this is usually how you kind of have to use this kind of language. You could just say infinity, which is about as abstract as we could probably imagine anything being. And people find ways of anchoring them using stuff like a black sea. In this case, of course, evoking that sense of, a dark sea that you can't see the bottom of it, you can't see the edge of it, you don't know what's in there. It's fairly frightening and, full of chaos. So that's probably how he's able to keep. And actually, he's very consistent. We have an island, a sea, and voyaging. So that's the other thing that maybe also helps is he's very consistent with the sort of imagery that he's trying to evoke throughout the entire sentence, the second sentence there.
So we do have the concretes, and that was I can't believe I haven't noticed that either. I'm not as clever as I thought it was. But yeah, you've got a consistency of concretes that tie together the abstractions. The abstractions are embedded in, or rather embedded, they are figurative in nature, right? Rather than being discursive in nature. And that probably helps quite a lot. Anything, Torin, that you might notice is in there?
One thing I noticed actually is that it seems like, at least like the way that this impacted me the most, is that I just noticed that kind of like, he paints this picture, yet I don't actually visualize anything in this case. It's purely, I guess, I suppose, just feelings that are evoked from, just I'm trying to think of I momentarily lost the right word. Give me one sec. I guess the context of, just being stranded on an, island in the midst of a sea is obviously this very hopeless feeling, and I just feel that, just kind of the abstract kind of thought of just that feeling, alone, he kind of was able to instill in this, these lines, and I very easily can pick up on it without actually seeing anything or, just picturing anything as I usually do.
Yeah, what I think is happening here is the goal for Algernon is to make one feel out of place in the world, right? This is kind of like an existential dread or existential angst evoking feeling. And so I think the constant pulling toward abstraction takes one out of the world, which makes one feel lost and thrown and stranded and ignorant. And I think that's part of the reason why um, it was actually a good idea to, we've got this very clean set of concrete metaphors, basically, to fluff those up with all of the abstractions because, yeah, it does give you that feeling. It's not meant to paint an image, it's made to make you feel. Perhaps despair upon looking on the vastness of space, which fits pretty well, for the beginning of Call of Cthulhu and Lovecraft in general. Um, why bring any of that up? And I guess I'm gonna wrap things up here. We've been chatting on for a while. Is I wanted to demonstrate that actually, like we showed, it's content and composition kind of go together. I wanted to give examples where we could show how you can evoke these feelings. You can get people invested. You could activate the sensory information. You could do that with the content of the individual words. So like at the level of the diction, you could do that at the sounds of the words as they combine together. You can do that with the sentence structure, right? We noticed with Cormac McCarthy and the wagon wheels, that being a run-on sentence rolling with three rolling sounding words, right? You can do all this if you focus on your prose and you have an idea that you aren't just saying a thing. There is a how alongside the what. And I hope that you listeners enjoyed reading along with us. And I appreciate you showing up. But before we go, make sure you check out our guest work. I won't make us run all the way back through it, but check out Dracula's Guest and Dracula's Match by Amaya Tenshi. I'll leave links for both of those. Also, keep an eye out for Agrippa's work. If he so chooses, I'll link his something for him. Do you have anything that you want to send people toward, Torin, at all?
Unfortunately not. My Minds profile is dead at the moment. Hopefully that'll
Okay.
change in the future.
All right. Well, in the future, we'll definitely shill as much of your stuff as possible. But yeah, keep a lookout because Amaya's got the third book, Dracula's Death, coming out. Um, and yeah, I really enjoyed having you guys on the podcast. Anything you guys want to say before we depart for the day?
Help support authors and artists. Go to your Kickstarter, I guess.
Definitely go to the Kickstarter.
Yeah, that's where you can help Torin. And I'm not kidding. You can help. You can put. We can make. We can promote Agrippa's professional work by going to my Kickstarter campaign, which you can access at wildilelit.com. It's a gigantic button right down at the bottom of the page. Please click on it. Please support. I don't know if I ran over the rewards at the beginning. You get a shout out if we reach our goals, which we got about a little tiny bit less than a month to reach. So we still have some time. If we reach your goal, you can get a shout out in a video for like $1. For like $5, you get in the backer list. So all of the books, I'm going to be publishing like 6 books using this money. So if you do that, you can have your name in 6 books for $5. That's pretty cheap. And of course, there's bigger and better rewards as you go. So just check that out again at wildilelit.com. I won't ramble on. Thank you guys for joining us. Make your prose. Put style in it. I can't think anymore. See you guys next time.
All right. Thank you for hosting. That was fun.